Hello, welcome to GEP's webinar, The Digital Levers You Need to Beat Escalating Costs. My name is Crystal Albanese, and I will be your host and moderator for today's session. First, before we launch into today's engaging webinar, I wanted to share a few details for the session. We welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time today, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so through the Q&A button on the right of your screen. Questions will be taken at the end of the webinar. Also, we're recording this webinar. You will all be emailed a link to watch the recording within 24 hours of the close of the webinar. And finally, if you'd like to reach out to our presenters today, you can do so via their information on the bios to the right of your screen. Great, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce you first to our presenters. Please welcome Mudit Kumar, Vice President Consulting with GEP. Mudit is responsible for driving large-scale strategic engagements, delivering sustainable cost savings and process improvement across various industries. He's a seasoned professional in the field of procurement and supply chain and has been cited in SIG, SIPS, ProcureCon, and Procurement Leaders publications for point of views on digital transformation and strategic cost reduction programs. He's also been recognized as Supply Chain and Demand's Pros to Know for driving next frontier innovations in procurement and supply chain. Also with us today is Shirley Hung, Partner, Business Process Services at Everest Group. Shirley is a member of Everest Group's dedicated team of analysts focused on customer experience management, finance and accounting outsourcing, and procurement and supply chain management outsourcing from a global perspective. She also works with procurement and sourcing professionals of large enterprises in providing research and information across Everest Group's business, process, and IT services, market trends, locations, and pricing expertise. Shirley is one of the firm's global leading advising senior stakeholders of global services, including enterprises, service providers, and investors in their strategic mandates and initiatives. Shirley has a proven track record in process benchmarking and improvement, strategy, planning and budgeting, workforce planning, and total rewards. She's a regular speaker at CXM events, IAOP, and SIG conferences. Welcome, Shirley and Mudit. And now I'll hand it over to Shirley to get us started.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. First, in case some of you are not aware and familiar with what we do at Everest Group, we are a research and advisory firm that focuses on global services. We have 200 analysts covering market trends and developments, service provider capabilities, location strategies, and analysis that may impact how business process services, IT services, and engineering services are delivered. So specifically, my team is responsible for our syndicated and custom research in horizontal functional areas such as procurement, supply chain management services, finance and accounting, and also customer experience management services. So as analysts, we've been closely following the unprecedented levels of global disruption over the past 18 months and how they've impacted the services industry and enterprise functions. According to IMF estimates, the global economy shrunk by more than 4% in 2020, which really was the worst decline since the Great Depression. And so it's no surprise that organizations across all industry sectors are prioritizing cost reductions to not only preserve value during the economic slowdown, but also to emerge stronger from the COVID-19 induced disruptions. And while the economic downturn remains a primary driver for adopting cost reduction measures, we are also seeing that companies are more open to employing total cost management techniques in a more disruptive manner for product or service enhancements, customer experience improvements, and to differentiate themselves from the competition. To emerge stronger from the economic slowdown, business leaders realize that they must identify ways to drive cost reductions without compromising on their growth initiatives to stay ahead of competition. In any type of cost reduction exercises, we know that the procurement and supply chain functions are critical focus areas for organizations due to their ability to influence not just direct costs, but also indirect costs. And while the business's focuses on sustaining and improving top-line growth, procurement and supply chain functions can lead cost reduction initiatives to improve the bottom line and profitability, such that they're doing so through leveraging digital technology. However, procurement still lags other more mature functions such as finance and accounting and HR in adopting digital levers such as analytics and automation. And meanwhile, supply chain functions in many organizations are still reliant on legacy systems and platforms that inhibit productivity enhancements and limit the benefits associated with cost reduction initiatives. So we'll be talking about a lot of these areas in the webinar today. But what I wanted to show in this slide is to just talk a little bit about the different cost pressures that businesses face in today's uncertain economic environment. We've listed here some of the most prominent ones. Obviously, for inflation and volatility, we're seeing that increasing across all major global geographies, which are having, significant impact on company cost bases. And it brings uncertainty to the top line as purchasing power decreases in a high inflation environment. And in many industries, it's difficult for companies to pass on those cost increases to customers because, they're afraid that it might lower demand and thus impact the revenues further. And so often businesses tend to absorb increased cost due to inflationary pressures because these tend to be cyclical. So we are seeing businesses focus on reducing costs so that they can mitigate these inflationary impacts and protect their margins. The second main cost driver around rising labor costs is a pretty self-evident one. Labor costs account for the majority of the cost base for many businesses. And after the 2008 financial crisis, we saw many labor cost optimization initiatives being launched. And these include offshoring of production to low-cost regions, such as in China, outsourcing of back office operations to countries such as India and the Philippines, and increasing leverage of contingent workers. However, the ability for businesses today to drive further savings from these strategies is largely incremental. What's making things worse is that our current environment is one characterized by talent shortages and rising salaries for not just high demand skills, but also across all types of jobs due to, expectations of increases in minimum wages and benefits. And this is eroding the significant cost benefits that businesses hope to achieve through their labor cost optimization initiatives. Around uneven demand, during global lockdowns, consumer and business demand fell. And while we're seeing signs of recovery in many areas, that rate of recovery is still slow and uncertain. So businesses are still trying to optimize their costs to maintain enough liquidity to meet their working capital requirements and minimize impacts on their bottom line. The next one around reshoring and localization, in response to trade wars and COVID-19, many businesses are reevaluating their sourcing strategies to mitigate the impact of global supply chain disruptions and prepare for future disruptions. Businesses are adapting their supply chains to more diversified manufacturing hubs, increasing their presence onshore and nearshore to ensure operational continuity. We're also seeing an increased demand for localized products and services to address region-specific customer needs. However, reshoring to onshore and nearshore geographies and the localization of products and services, they really could impact operating margins due to, higher wages and the need for significant capital investments. So to be economically viable under these conditions, companies need to look at new avenues to optimize their costs. And finally, just to speak a little bit about the saturation of benefits for short-term budget cuts. Obviously, being able to put pressure on discretionary spend reduction programs, that's quite easy to implement, but it doesn't drive sustainable benefits and could impact and hinder businesses' long-term growth aspirations. During the initial COVID-19 induced disruptions, many companies resorted to blanket budget cuts across different areas to reduce costs. And while these initiatives can help mitigate the impact of short-term cash pressures, without investment in transformation, it becomes nearly impossible to deliver the kind of long-term cost efficiency that an organization requires to emerge stronger from the economic slowdown. Pandemic-led disruptions, economic slowdowns, and associated cost pressures really haven't been kind to most industries. However, the severity of the impact across industries varies, as we show here. Industries such as travel and oil and gas were severely impacted due to significant drops in demand during global shutdowns, while they struggled with high operating cost structures. Manufacturing, CPG, and retail also face great challenges dealing with supply chain disruptions, rising raw material costs, and volatility in demand. But by comparison, cost pressures faced by some of the regulated industries such as healthcare and BFS have been less because declines in some products and services have been offset by increases in other areas. So their primary focus has been to align their cost structures to shifting customer demand and preferences to drive growth and remain competitively relevant. This focus is largely the same for the high-tech and telecom industries, which are working on expanding their operations to meet soaring demand due to businesses moving online and workforces transitioning to remote working environments. But across all of these industry sectors and for varying reasons, we are seeing pressure to recalibrate traditional cost structures and focus on optimizing costs. Revamping cost structures enables organizations to focus their investments and initiatives in strategic areas and achieve greater ROI. This is essential to achieve cost differentiation, drive growth in the next normal, and gain cost advantage in respective industries. As I mentioned before, short-term cost-cutting initiatives have limited benefits and are not aligned with businesses' strategic priorities. And in the meantime, benefits associated with previous waves of initiatives, such as offshoring, have nearly reached saturation limits and can no longer be considered differentiators. This is where procurement and supply chain teams can really step in and add a great deal of value. With their ability to influence both COGS and SG&A costs, procurement and supply chain teams can play a more strategic role in driving sustainable improvements to cost structures and steering businesses competitively into the next normal by leveraging digital technologies such as service delivery optimization, analytics, and platform consolidation, cloud computing, and mobility. The digital enablement of procurement and supply chain operations can not only help companies achieve significant cost reductions, but also achieve positive outcomes in areas such as risk management and supply chain resilience. It can help organizations shift from siloed processes, technologies, and systems to integrated customer-centric operations. So we're showing here in this slide some of the key impacts of digital levers on driving cost reductions. I'll take one of those in the interest of time. The first one, the integrated processes, systems, and data. You know, in many companies, there is significant fragmentation in procurement and supply chain in terms of both process and technology, which creates interoperability challenges. Multiple manual touch points and handoffs across different teams in the fragmented ecosystem can lead to longer cycle times, higher error rates, and significant duplication of effort, which increases operational costs. Organizations can implement digital levers such as, RPA and IoT to integrate different processes and systems and improve visibility across the supply chain. This can act as a bridge between various vendor dealer systems, ERPs, and CRMs, and drive better coordination and calibration between different teams. I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but as far as the other kind of impacts, we go into a bit more detail about that in an upcoming paper that GEP will be publishing on their website on this topic, and a lot of the things that I'm saying here today will be available in that detail in the paper. So as we show in this schematic, digital levers can deliver great value through integrating supply chain data coming from a variety of sources. IoT technologies can be used to capture data real time. And with RPA automating workflows, this information can be fed into the ERP in complex supply chain data structures. Intelligent document processing solutions can be leveraged to automatically cleanse and classify data, which provides the foundation for applying AI and analytics to derive insights on spend, suppliers, products, and inventory levels. This helps businesses identify key trends, mitigate risks, and make more informed and proactive decisions to optimize costs. Organizations have already started exploring the role of digital technology to understand their potential impact in driving cost savings, along with value-added benefits such as working capital optimization, risk mitigation, and improved stakeholder experience. Many successful use cases are emerging in the procurement and supply chain ecosystem, helping drive significant cost reductions and cost efficiencies in both direct and indirect spend. We've included a couple of use cases here that illustrate the impact of digital levers in the logistics management and production planning processes. These slides just provide a high-level overview of the use cases, but you will find more detail in our paper, as I mentioned before. I encourage you to download the paper once it's available on the GEP website to get a more detailed view on not just these use cases, but also the other key messages I've tried to highlight so far in the webinar. And so with this, and in the interest of time, I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Mudit to offer his perspective from a practitioner's perspective. Over to you. Muta, you might be speaking on mute.
I was. Thank you, Shirley. I was just saying that I really appreciate a great summary outlining some very key mega trends, how companies have been operating and facing some key cost pressures. And then most importantly, also about how different industries have been affected by some of these changes. Taking a step back, and I think as we have understood that context overall of where some of these challenges are, the most natural question is like, what should companies do about it, right? So the so what kind of equation that we need to solve here. Again, like Shirley, I think you did a fantastic job in terms of articulating some of those approaches and tactics that companies have taken, especially as it comes to some short-term immediate budget cuts. That's the natural instinct of a lot of companies out there, to go after some of the overheads, some of the discretionary spending. And that is typically the pain that can be eased in the short term. However, like for sustainable cost savings over a period of time, companies really ought to look at their cost of goods sold, right? Again, I'm pivoting back to some of the companies that are selling products, not so much of the high-tech telecom industry, but most companies which are in the business of managing supply chain, creating, developing, manufacturing products, whether it is automotive, CPG, industrial goods. For all of these companies, cost of goods sold tends to be a very big proportion of the cost that they are dealing with. In most cases, to the tune of 60 to 75%. So even if they were able to kind of create some very painful, severe budget cuts on discretionary spending, it's still not going to have the same impact on the overall costs of the company, and eventually back to the operating margins, which is what the Wall Street truly cares about. So what we are trying to showcase here is that, COGS is an important part of the equation. When companies face challenges, the natural reaction sometimes is to go to more discretionary areas, but to really create the impact, they do need to think about COGS, and that tends to include all of your raw materials, packaging, and for most companies, even the logistics part is captured under their standard cost tables, which flows into the cost of goods sold versus the SG&A. So just another double click on what all has happened in the cost of goods sold. As I was highlighting earlier, there are multiple factors that have gone into it. And these charts are literally just a couple of illustrations that demonstrate how massive the increase has been over past few years. So all commodities have gone through the roof. Whether we look at food commodities like oil, soybean, and stuff like that, whether we look at metals, copper, aluminum, steel, whether we look at packaging, resins, HDPE, corrugated, paper and pulp indices, or if we look at logistics and line haul rate indices, they have literally gone off the roof, anywhere from 30, 40 to even 100+% over last 12 months. And this is a challenge that most CPOs are juggling right now. It's like fundamentally the market has moved. A lot of the costs that companies are incurring, and we spoke about labor earlier, there are acute labor shortages, there are some of those trends that are impacting the overheads and SG&A, but even on the material side, there is a significant inflation that companies are battling. And it is across the board. It's not just one set of commodities that are seeing severe inflation. It is pretty much across the spectrum: food commodities, metal commodities, oil and gas, any kind of oil-related commodities, rubber and substrates of oil, And then, of course, logistics costs. Everybody knows how crazy they are. So I think the summary here is that there is a pressure from the market, fundamentals have shifted, and now procurement is taking a step back and saying, okay, what can we really do about this? This is a commodity-driven inflation. It's across geographies, across commodities. Is there something substantiative we can do, right? So this is where some of the new digital tools, new innovative approaches really come to bear, because the commodities are what they are. There is no way for procurement teams to really address those. I mean, I know some companies would have set up some advanced hedging programs that can hedge some of these costs, at least for a period of time. But outside of some of those financial instruments, you know, it is what it is. So what could procurement really do? We can look to respond for global arbitrage. We can use different pricing constructs, and then we can use some best-in-class outcome-based thinking that is not kind of like a transactional buy. We are really taking a step back and starting to reevaluate what is it that we are truly buying. And in today's discussion, I mean, there are a lot of different tools, a lot of different strategies that we can deploy. For today's discussion, we are just going to hone in on the three that we think could really help companies today. The first and foremost is advanced analytics and real-time market intelligence. We'll talk more on what that means. The second key aspect of these new digital tools is value engineering. And then the third key aspect is outcome-based contractual agreements with supplier partners. These are the three that could really help companies, and I'll try to cover each of these individually to add a bit more context on what they really mean and how we as procurement practitioners can deploy them in real life. So let's look at advanced analytics up front, right? So most companies, when they think about analytics, and they tend to look at historical data, and then they tend to make decisions for future. That's how most reporting and analytics function. I'm sure a lot of us can resonate with that. And that is almost like driving a car, looking in the rear view mirror, and you can all imagine what happens, right? I mean, there is going to be a crash. And unfortunately, that's how our analytics prowess, that's how our data strategy has been structured for the longest time. What would really help is to move from the hindsight, which is looking in the past, to insight, which is looking at the trends, analyzing them, understanding them, running some scenarios on it, to moving to foresight, really the predictive analytics that can tell us in advance where these things are moving. And that is what is going to drive some of these advanced decisions. For us to be able to predict what the future holds, to analyze the scenarios as they stand today. And these advanced tools could really help us, simply put, use a bit more math in procurement as we look to solve some of these inflationary challenges. So just staying on that slide for a bit. So what does insight really mean? So insight really means that we go and we look at the full TCO picture, total cost of ownership picture, and we look at each individual parts of the cost, not just the landed cost. And we are also able to run some simulations, some scenarios. What if we changed the origin of some of the materials we buy? Is it cheaper on the material price? Is it cheaper on the total cost? How does it impact our lead times? How does it impact our logistics costs? Is it lower? Is it higher? So you could literally break down individual costs that you pay for a landed price. We can then start to run some simulations on what if we changed one of those parameters on where these costs are originating from, and look at some real analysis on where it could lead us for the future. The second key aspect for what we are looking for here is outcome-based contracts. So if we step back and really think through what they are, I mean, we talked about these multiple different scenarios that we could do. We could run some statistical regression analysis to put some foresight forward that can again entail some forward buys that companies could create. They can really rethink their strategy and when they make some buying decisions. But at the same time, if your contract doesn't give you any flexibility for price, then none of that analysis really matters, right? I mean, it's like knowing all the details, having all of the ammunition at your hands, but then your hands tied to the hip. I mean, you have ammunition, but you can't do anything with it. So the real outcome-based contracts allow some flexibility on how we can leverage some of that analysis, really think about the value that gets generated from these contracts, and create some flexibility in the contracts to be able to move some levers around, to still have the same outcome that you want to achieve for a particular product, but be able to move some of these levers around and be able to derive some benefit out of it. So for instance, you could align some supplier incentives for certain outcomes on year-over-year efficiencies. You can allow the outcome-based contracts for specific yield provisions for the manufacturing. You can tie the outcome-based contracts for certain inflationary pressures to be absorbed by your suppliers, some fluctuations allowed, some measures that kick in if you go into high inflation gears. The contractual arrangement is more broader than just a fixed price agreement. Here is the product I'm going to buy. This is the price per kilo of sugar, and that's how it's going to be for the foreseeable future. I mean, that's not really ideal in terms of flexibility and innovation in terms of contractual relationships. So that's the second lever, so that if we do create ammunition, then we need to have the wherewithal, and we don't want our hands tied from contractual perspective. In fact, the contract should encourage and should drive us to thinking in terms of the overarching outcome versus just a price per product kind of scenarios. So that's the second big lever that the companies can use. And then the third lever here is value engineering. Again, very interesting. And this is where we go and elevate our thinking above from just negotiating pricing. So there are multiple value engineering strategies, a few of them that we highlighted here and we wanted to discuss in the conversation today. The first one is SKU rationalization. I mean, again, this is companies with all the right intentions eventually seeing huge proliferation of SKUs across their different products. I mean, we have recently worked with certain companies where, for a food company, we have seen like multiple dozens of emulsifiers in a food product, and no clear rationale on why. I mean, it happens because we work with many industries that are on very fast pace of product growth. Many times, different types of ingredients, components are being used to differentiate, but eventually, once you take a step back, it leads to a lot of proliferation in your bill of materials, recipe, depending on which industry you are in. So there is an opportunity to look at a holistic view of what components, what ingredients are being used in different products, and look at ways to rationalize. Then there is a philosophy on how we can redesign the product to reduce cost. Is our product overspec'd for what it should be designed in the first place? So for instance, if the product is designed to take 1,000 PSI load, but the thickness was designed for 5,000, then why, right? So we do see some challenges at times, and there are opportunities to go back and reevaluate the spec to value equation for different products, and then whether or not it's in the right balance. Minimum order quantities, again, like we talked about before, like we need to have the right ammunition, the right foresight. The contractual structures allow for some of that agreements and value to be flown in, but then we should reevaluate whether our purchasing patterns are the most conducive to be buying some of these materials. So we can look at the overarching inventory to cost equation, minimum order quantities, really look at multi-echelon optimization of product, not just the piece price, but where it gets bought, where it gets stored, where it gets consumed, in which plants, and that looks at the life cycle of the in-month product and where it gets processed and consumed in particular plants. And then the last bit is really explore the alternatives, right? I mean, this is looking at what different types of alternatives can be used for products. So not just looking at spec to value equation, but looking at alternatives for the ingredients themselves. So many industries end up using packaging products that may not be the best geared for their particular usage. And then taking a step back and saying what's the right alternatives that we can use. Is the corrugated the right one? Is resin the right one? That's just a packaging example, but the same thinking can be applied to many different parts of the cost equation. So that entire spectrum constitutes value engineering strategies. And as you can see, like none of these are essentially tied to the pricing in the market. As I shared before, pricing in the market is what it is. It is up to us as procurement practitioners to really find the next level of innovation in making sure that we can create the right value and the right cost savings for our organizations. So with that, I'll take a pause. I'll hand it over to Crystal and see if there are any questions, any comments from the group, and looking forward to answering and engaging with the group today. Back to you, Crystal.
Great. Thank you, Mudit and Shirley. That was a really informative and engaging session. We do have a few audience questions. Let me go ahead and open up the first one, and we will start with for Mudit. Procurement has been lagging in adopting digital technologies while supply chain teams still rely on legacy systems. How do enterprises bridge the digital divide to gain significant cost reduction opportunities?
That's a great question. In summary, the organizations need to look to upgrade their digital systems. I mean, but we all know it. Now, the real question is where and how, right? I mean, we all know that ERP systems have been highly ingrained in some of the processes, and for good reasons. They are strong systems that provide good financial back-end and accounting systems. They are systems of records. Now, what we think is truly missing is systems that are based on artificial intelligence, that are designed for insights and not just designed to store records. And that is, I think, a key aspect of the new digital age that companies need to evaluate for themselves. But I do sincerely believe that companies need to look at technologies that are cloud native, that are designed with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms, and that are designed for practitioner insight and not just for creating a strong record of operational processes, whether it is orders, receipts, whether it is a procure to pay process or an order to cash process, the two kind of the mirrors of supply chain processes. The companies really need to look at the new age of cloud-based solutions.
Okay, thank you. The next question, and I'll maybe open it to both of you, see who wants to take this one. What's the comment of carbon footprint reduction in steel and other metals? Any further headwinds coming, or is this an opportunity?
Maybe I can go first, Crystal. Shirley, feel free to jump in. From carbon footprint perspective, I think I personally see a huge attention to sustainability agenda in general across the companies. I do think companies have wanted to do it in the past, but now it has become much more real at the board level, where they have taken clear ownership of many targets, more robust tracking of what those ESG goals are. And then companies are putting the time and energy and investment to some degree to make sure that happens. Some industries more than the others. I think to your question, Crystal, is important, absolutely. For industries that are directly facing the consumers, it is starting to reflect in their products. If you look at CPG and retail industry, you would see it very clearly demonstrated in the kind of products they are putting out, how environmentally sustainable these companies want to be in just how they procure food or how they are looking at packaging and reducing plastic. Really, I think it is becoming more and more real, and I think procurement being at the center of supply relationships, at the center of driving how some of those materials get selected, and in some ways, probably the most cross-functional group in nature inside the companies is very well positioned to solve this puzzle for the companies. Still a work in progress. I don't think there is a clear solution out there, but it is seeing a lot of traction across industries.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. It's an organization's ESG strategy is becoming a really strategic part of the way that they position themselves in the marketplace, and we know that a lot of consumers and businesses alike are factoring that into decisions on who they want to do business with, and that is being reflected in all kinds of different ways, you know, even from the way that it's being reported and financial reporting and those kinds of things as well. In our organization, we are doubling down actually on our research in the sustainability, impact sourcing, ESG kind of space as a reflection of this overarching market trend. So I think that it is something that is here to stay. I echo Mudit's kind of comments that procurement and supply chain teams have a really great role to play in this area, and so it'll be really interesting to see how this manifests over the next few years.
Okay, great. How do you believe IT can play a role in reducing indirect spend in the banking industry?
I'll try to answer that, but I think there could be multiple facets to it or multiple dimensions to it. So I think IT is a very, very powerful. I think it's not just a cost function anymore. I do truly think that for banking industry, IT is core, very much the core of what that industry stands for. Most financial industry is going to what we would consider like a fintech kind of a world, where majority of their processes are going virtual. We need the enabling technologies to make sure that they stay virtual. I still remember a Fortune 10 bank. Their website was out for like a bare minute, and it was reported on CNBC and Wall Street. So that's the impact information technology has on the financial services, large banking institutions today. In terms of they are definitely a function that enables the whole company, and that is central to the business continuity. How they can impact cost, I think a couple of different ways. One, I think there is an opportunity to look at more end-to-end solutions, which can drive a bit more cost effectiveness. I mean, this is an industry that has traditionally been a high margin industry. So for better or worse, I mean, good for the industry, there hasn't been as big of a focus on reducing costs, just by the virtue of how that business operated. Plus, some of the procurement processes tended to be very risk focused because of OCC guidelines that were released in 2012. So now I think there is an opportunity to not to say that, reduce the focus on risk, but there may be an opportunity to still have a focus on TPRM, third-party risk management, but also start to include some more focus from cost savings perspective in the systems themselves. And I do think there could be a bigger collaboration with procurement. IT and procurement together can look at where the IT investments are being made and how can financial services companies just drive the maximum benefit from those investments. So those two would be my suggestions, given the nuances in financial services industry.
Okay, great, thank you. Shirley, a question for you. What steps can enterprises take to evaluate the impact of cost pressures on their operations and the digital levers across procurement and supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what organizations really first need to understand is doing a current state, assessment. They really need to analyze what their existing cost structures are like, and how that's being impacted by changing market dynamics and consumer behaviors and expectations. The severity of cost pressures really can depend on a variety of different factors, including, macroeconomic and industry-specific considerations, organizational-specific considerations, as well as, what the expected duration and type of the cost impact could be. But once, an organization really understands what that current state severity is of cost pressure on themselves, then the second step really is to understand and evaluate the impact of digital technology in mitigating those cost pressures and driving sustainable savings. And, considerations for that type of analysis would include, looking at your current state of digital maturity, what the extent of fragmentation is within your processes and systems, understanding the existing process health, as well as, the scale of your operations. We actually, in the paper that I referenced before, we provide a guiding framework that can help organizations understand how they should approach digital transformation based on the severity of cost pressure that they face. And the potential impact of digital levers to alleviate those pressures. It may not always be appropriate to prioritize large-scale transformation. Instead, it may be better for organizations to take a more opportunistic approach or a watch and monitoring type of approach. That's kind of what I would recommend that organizations do is kind of take it on a step-by-step basis and really focus on the current state and their objectives and what they want to try to achieve.
Great, thank you. Okay, Mudit, are there any particular digital technologies that should be prioritized first to deliver on business impact?
That's an interesting question. Where do you prioritize? I think it is really difficult, Crystal, to have one size fit all answer. I know that's still not really answering the question, but I think any company who is really trying to think about prioritization should start with evaluating the current landscape of technology. So if I have to think about what are my big priorities, I would start with asking the following questions. Question number one would be, do I even know where my spend is? I mean, it has been a problem that has been solved by most of the companies, but I recognize there are still some companies out there which do not have clear transparency into their spend data. So that would be my first starting point to really understand where is it that we are spending all our money, with which suppliers, what categories. That's the most basic element, and then it builds up from there. You go into having an end-to-end e-sourcing kind of a platform, having some kind of a platform that does end-to-end requisition to pay really well. So you're not just creating good value in terms of contract, but you're also being able to manage the right kind of buying channel compliance through that P2P platforms. Contract lifecycle management, really important, so that the contracts you do create, there is visibility to contract, and then you're really getting the contracted pricing. And once we have done that foundational layer of what we call source to pay spectrum, then you start getting into more advanced thinking. I mean, ideally, you would want to go with a source to pay platform that already has those advanced insights, forecasting capabilities, really that foresight built into it, AI and machine learning built into it. But if for some reason the existing STP platforms don't have it, then you might have to go with additional technologies that can bring in some of that advanced analytics, predictive analytics into the systems. So hopefully that gives a framework for the audience and for us as practitioners to think through, but it would really depend on where the baseline is, and then you go and build from there.
Makes sense. Okay. And what looks like our final question here, Shirley, how do you think companies can best overcome their short-term cost-cutting focus to address longer-term and sustainable cost structure changes?
Yeah, I think there is a broader realization that businesses, they need to make some fundamental adaptations to their cost strategies and structures to align to changing market dynamics and also consumer preferences. There's this realization that tactical measures to optimize cash flow and working capital is not enough. It helps organizations survive the global shutdowns, but it doesn't necessarily give them the tools and the resiliency to be able to remain competitive in a ever dynamic type of environment. So there needs to be this more radical shift in cost management strategies to really make sure that resources are focused on areas of strategic importance, while at the same time, streamlining costs and dedicating efforts in the right ways. So some of the methodologies or approaches that we're seeing organizations adopt is zero-based budgeting, which relies on making justifications for each budget cycle based upon what your expected needs are, as opposed to trying to do that based upon historical needs, to Mudit's point, looking in the rear view mirror to try to move forward. So budgets and cost structures are defined around what is required by an organization in the upcoming period, and rather than blanket increases or reductions based on previous year's budgets. Obviously, that takes more effort to do, but also the payback and the value that's created from doing it right can be quite substantial. Once cost structures are optimized, many organizations are conducting should cost modeling and analysis to estimate, cost impacts and drive cost efficiencies in areas such as supplier negotiations and resource optimization. And they are doing this to proactively monitor different cost elements and drivers and understand those variances to unlock new saving opportunities and mitigate the impact of our potential impact of rising costs on the bottom line. So it's not an easy thing. I mean, I think when you focus on the short term, oftentimes it's easier, but I do think that there is a larger recognition by many businesses that that's not enough, that the runway is getting shorter, and that there is a need to look further into the future and do things in a different way in order to drive sustainable change and have a more resilient cost structure going forward.
Great. Thank you both so much. We are just at time, and we have some really great questions, and thank you both for a really informative and engaging session. If anyone has any questions, again, feel free. You can reach out directly to Shirley and Mudit. And thank you for your time, and that concludes our presentation for today.